Hi, everybody. Welcome to Next to Media. I'm Mike Shields. My guest this week is Andrew Rosen. He is a media analyst, founder of Parkour, newsletter practitioner, a guy I know who's been following the streaming space for a long time and now also is really diving into AI. Andrew, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Mike, thanks for having me.
So many different ways this conversation could go. I want to get into what you've been writing about recently, but I was looking for your expertise on the call it I guess we're past the streaming wars into the rebundling time. I want to get into that stuff, but I want to talk about sports specifically because I think it's, we just had the Super Bowl recently, huge numbers. That was not on a subscription-based streamer, but we're seeing more and more of that. You had the Fubo news recently. You've got another attempt at a sports bundle. How do you kind of sum up the state of streaming and sports? Because it seems like it's great for business, but maybe not always great for consumers, depending on who you are. How do you think about that right now?
Yeah, I think the simplest way, to boil everything down is the Tubi ad with the guy with the fleshy cowboy hat for a head, whatever.
Very strange.
The whole line, it was a strange ad, but it was actually it was a really sort of perfect way of summing up where we are. Because the tagline was, if it's in you, it's in here. And the basic point was, if you're a fan of Westerns, we have Westerns.
Yeah.
If you're a fan of like Harry Potter type fantasy, Tubi has fantasy. And when you're a sports fan, right, the question becomes, if I'm a fan of, like Dallas Cowboys living in New York City, who has the best Dallas Cowboys coverage when I'm in New York City?
Right.
And if I'm a fan of, and so that simple example is like, how do you serve that fandom? The only legacy media company that has really openly discussed this and invested in this is the New York Times when they bought The Athletic.
Right.
And David Perpich, who's a publisher of The Athletic, said we saw fandom and we had to figure out how do we participate in that. And so they've done a lot of interesting things. I think you remember they did a recent deal with eBay around memorabilia. But the point is, where they start, when you start with fandom and you go look at the world through Tubi's lens, or you look at the world through the New York Times and the Athletics lens, you start with that super passionate fandom, somebody who has near inelastic demand for their favorite team, for their favorite sport. Legacy media companies weren't built for that.
Right.
And they were actually built for the opposite, which is they were built to fill the airwaves and cable channel broadcast.
Yeah.
Right. It was, and if you hit the right sport and you were able to promote the right game, there were enormous returns for you.
And so I don't mean to cut your flow off, but it's interesting that because the money is still in the live sports, the rights, right? But the fandom thing is perhaps more important generationally than it's been in the past. And that's a weird place for, I think, the legacy media companies, the traditional rights holders, the leagues. That's a challenge.
It's the thing that I've hit on a lot, just as a theme in the past when I've written about media companies, and I don't use this as a sort of like, there's no one I begrudge in the media business. If anything, like I really try and listen to what people say and map it back to the question of, do they or do they not understand exactly what we just discussed, right? That consumers have an inelastic demand for what they have, and then they want to be served in different ways. And the Athletics, one example. If you go to another genre entirely, like anime, Sony's Crunchyroll is another example where they just hyper serve fans of anime. And then in the case of Disney, where they serve fans of Disney content, but ESPN exists within that. And the question that they face as Disney and as ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut, as a longtime powerhouse in cable broadcasting is, well, the consumers still love sports, but what's the business of serving them? And I think that you're seeing a lot of, the Athletic is interesting because it's their argument is, well, somebody's going to pay for news and somebody's going to pay for memorabilia, access to memorabilia. And there's another deal that they did that I'm forgetting, but that they've added to their flywheel. Maybe it's just being part of the New York Times bundle.
Right.
But then the second part of it is, what if I'm a fan, but I don't need the news? Then what are the business models? And I just want to watch sports. Well, DAZN and ESPN Plus have made bets that say, well, if you're a fan, you're going to tune in when you want to tune in. And what DAZN has learned, because you see, it continues to lose money, but its biggest problem is that.
I should remind people, DAZN is like,
yes.
It's the John Skipper thing. They have a lot of UFC. They have some soccer, but they're a subscription-based streaming sports alternative, right?
Yes, and they're more. They do better in Europe.
Yeah.
And so I find that, but I mean, they're more focused on Europe. I shouldn't say they do better. I mean, they still broadcast here, but they're much more penetrated in Europe. But the thing that they struggled with is, if you're assuming that AC Milan fans are going to stream a Milan match instead of watching it on their televisions, there actually aren't enough AC Milan fans to justify the scale of the investment that they've made both in the broadcast and the streaming technology. And so when you, and I think ESPN Plus struggles with that too. I'm a huge fan of Barcelona Football Club in the La Liga in Spain. I've been watching their matches pretty regularly this season, just because they're having a great season and they have these really amazing players. But my relationship with FC Barcelona is a very weird one as a sports fan, because number one, ESPN never tells me when a game is going to start. What I mean by that is I can go to ESPN.com and they'll tell me what time the game is going to start. But the Apple Sports app actually sends me a notification 15 minutes before the match, or at some sort of moment in the match where it's getting the score is close, or somebody's coming onto the pitch who's a legendary player. Like, Apple is telling me when to tune into ESPN, and it's not ESPN.
Is that just it's not a big enough priority, or a flaw in the interface or the partnership?
I don't. I mean, the short answer is yes. I don't know. I mean, there's so many. The thing is, but I do think it's a symptom of the challenge that ESPN has, right? Because I do go to ESPN to read the news about FC Barcelona. I do watch the highlights there, but it's Apple that tells me whether or not I should tune into a match.
They're the gatekeeper. They're the direct. They're driving you around.
And so that's the disconnect in all this. And I find that, and then you can sort of keep going down that long tail list of things that sports fans do, right? I'm not a sports bettor, but somebody who likes sports betting may turn to DraftKings or FanDuel for that news, that sports news about their team, and engage with their team that way and betting that way. And so it's just and then I think there's also the aspect of, if I'm a Barcelona fan, should the ESPN Plus app be personalized to me? And I'm sure this is the question that they're dealing with as they're building out flagship. And if so, what is a version of the ESPN app personalized to an FC Barcelona fan that's going to make me more likely to engage and less likely to churn out and seek a cheaper service or an alternative service to get my news and to get my notifications? It's the fundamental problem is I can't connect to my team in a way where they can look at me and say, okay, here's all the ways that this guy's going to pay money. It's actually the opposite, right? Which is, this guy's going to tune into a broadcast and then he's going to disappear, and maybe he'll watch something, or he or she will watch something on the app maybe another time. But they don't know that. Like, they have no relationship with me as a customer. Whereas Tubi's whole sales pitch, Netflix's wholesale pitch is. And even YouTube's whole sales pitch, right? Is we understand you so that when you tune into,
you're here all the time. I see, I learn about you. I feed you stuff that you care about.
Right. And you're going to be happy. We know how to delight you. And I find that in the sports world, I think it's, honestly, I just think it's a generational thing. Meaning that the people who run, look, Bob Iger's in his 70s. The people who run ESPN are sort of closer to their 60s. You find that you just don't have a generation of people who were raised with like the D2C business logic, and understand it and have run a business that way. I think that there is a generation that does understand that. They're currently in. I mean, if you think about it, like being D2C truly in like the smartphone era. I think that generation is pretty early in their careers. You know, if you think to,
they're not in control yet. They're not there. They're not in positions of control yet.
Right. And look, like subscriptions only really emerged in iOS in 2009.
Yeah.
And then in Android in 2011. So we're 13 years after that, which means if anybody who sort of came into a legacy media business to solve those problems is 13 years into their career. So maybe they're in their 30s.
Right.
Like you're just not going to see that generational shift that needs to happen is so far away. And that's the biggest problem for sports right now.
Okay. I want to come back to that idea, but, getting back to the sports rights situation at the moment, I guess, like I said, if you're a cord cutter, there's you can get a lot more sports than you could a few years ago, which is great, I think. But there's these attempts at the roll up. There's no simple solution for that. It seems like you had a venue that I never thought was going to go away because of this FUBU deal. You have a new one coming from the satellite guys. It still seems like it's going to be so fragmented that you're not going to be able to satisfy the sports fan, that a bundle is not going to solve all your problems. But I could be wrong. What is your take on that? And what is your take on the flagship launch coming from ESPN?
I mean, so on Venue, I think the biggest problem with Venue is that, again, coming back to the generational thing, but just as a pure like D2C, a 2B versus the 2B value proposition versus the wholesale, cable channel proposition is very, very few people want to pay for a cable channel online, right? Like the cable channel is not a value proposition that people search out. And in fact, what they're getting, if anything, is the free version on fasts, right? On free ad supported TV services. So I can get a cable channel on Pluto or Tubi or Roku or Google TV or Samsung or LG, but that's going to have like the content that I want, and even Amazon that's going to have the
What's
content
the
that I want to watch.
distinction you're making? They don't want to. They pay for a streaming service, but not a cable channel. I think I know what you mean, but what are you getting?
Sure, it's a fair question. So when I don't like all of us when back in the day when we had a linear and those who still have a linear TV connection, you're not paying for cable channels. You're paying for access to cable channels, and cable channels are part of the value proposition of having cable access. But really, at the end of the day, you just want like crystal clear picture in your TV and a certain number of channels, and maybe there's certain options. Channels that you want, like HBO and Showtime, etc. But when you're online, YouTube is not cable channels, Netflix is not cable channels. Fast takes the cable channel, the TV guide interface and the cable channel concept, right? That there's a channel of content that you can tune into, and just offers it for free. So the idea that
idea of paying for that is just weird when you've got so many free linear channels like that online.
Right. It's just totally disconnected from where the consumer is today. Like, the point, the real issue, and again, this is the most interesting thing about thinking about Tubi, like if it's in you, it's in here's. And when you think about something like the ESPN flagship is, what does the sports fan want online? And, if they want something like a cable channel experience, well, odds are they're probably not going to pay for it. Right? I mean, that's the most fascinating part of it. And I just read your newsletter on this. Like the most fascinating part of the Super Bowl broadcast on Tubi was that people didn't pay for it, but they got a Super Bowl broadcast. Yeah. That was actually better than broadcasts on YouTube TV and other services. Like, there's no lag. It was high quality. It was excellent. It was really like that. That is a paradigm shift. And so that if you were a sports fan, you got what you needed from Tubi that day. And then the question that ESPN, and it's a very difficult question that I don't think they're going to answer well, just because I just think that just from listening to Disney earnings calls, reading, having read the history of how Disney has dealt with technological change over the past few decades. And they had a really rough decade between 2010 and 2019.
ESPN, the phone and things like that.
Sure. Like, and it's, to me, it doesn't matter that they failed. It just matters to me that whether or not they've learned from their mistakes. And I find that my favorite quote from Bob Iger is that I think is sort of the poker tell of all poker tells is when he said to the Wall Street Journal 6 years ago, we're not doing algorithmic personalization. I think if they want Mickey Mouse and they're clicking on Mickey Mouse. And this is something he said to the Wall Street Journal. So it's not something that like is anything that I've dug up from anywhere. I mean, you can still find it online. And then 6 years later, now literally in the most recent earnings call, he's saying, well, we're really seeing the benefits of dynamic personalization and in keeping users happy and retaining them. And so they've obviously learned, but it took them 6 years. And the difficult question that you have to ask them, and the difficult question that they face is, can they move faster? I mean, they've got a CTO who came over from YouTube. Maybe they can. Are they learning the right lessons? And then the ultimate and very difficult question is, again, like, what is somebody paying them for? Like, what does it mean? What is fandom? And I find that Peacock has made very aggressive multi-billion-dollar bets. Sorry, NBC Universal through Peacock has made multi-billion-dollar bets on sports, but they still have NBC content next to sports, right? Like the idea is that somebody's going to use that app for NBC content and sports.
You're going to watch Bravo and the Chiefs game or whatever,
right? But if you looked at Peacock and said, does that have what the sports fan needs? The simple answer is well, they broadcast, but they don't have anything else. And I think if you look at ESPN.com, does it have what the sports fan needs? Yes, I think it has a lot of what the sports fan needs. Does ESPN Plus have what the sports fan needs? No. I find Barcelona matches next to, like college lacrosse matches I've never watched.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
Like there are fans of that, but there's not many. Yeah,
but I'm not one of them.
Right.
And that's my point. And I think that their difficult question, and I don't know how they're going to, I think it's a very difficult question, just both from sports is a relationship business, and sports is a numbers game. And I think I don't think there are any easy answers to the question of how do you make sure that the people who want volleyball, know that college volleyball or college lacrosse, know that it's on ESPN. And then secondly, you're getting some form of Apple type notification that says, I know you love college volleyball or college lacrosse, tune into ESPN Plus, or ESPN flagship to watch it. That's not easy. But more importantly, like, and this is sort of the interesting thing about Iger's, when the philosophical divide between him and Chapek, was, his successor, and now predecessor, but that philosophical divide was what's the role of data and what's the role of creative.
Right.
And Iger was very loudly and very angrily beating the drum as much as he could to say, don't buy into data. And I think at this point, for them to succeed, they really actually need to figure out what it means to say, for Tubi, like, if it's in you, if you are a sports fan and you love volleyball or you love gymnastics or you love some sort of sport, this is the place to go where you're going to be able to watch TV and get the best coverage. And I don't know if they're thinking that way. Right. The way they're talking is much more like, you like sports and you like sports betting, you're going to love flagship. And I think that's a very, I'm not saying there's an easy answer, but I am saying that there are people out there who have clearer answers than traditional legacy media executives.
Yeah. I do wonder about the prospects of flagship. First of all, we don't know the price. You're going for a sports fan that really cares about sports, but they don't have everything. They have a lot of college football, a lot of NBA, but not everything. You're going to have to package that up with other things. It's going to get costly, or it seemingly it's going to get costly over time. They might as well just get cable. We'll see. I want to ask you about, generally speaking, you've written about this for years, this idea that everybody in legacy media was racing to become a DTC business, right? Chasing Netflix, trying to emulate those companies. Then all of a sudden they're like, I don't know if I don't want to do this. I don't know if it makes sense. Where are we on that path? Was that a mistake? Should they be heading that way? Can they do it? Why is that significant?
Yeah, I don't think it was. I don't think it was a mistake to pursue it. I just think that the way that the fundamental philosophical mistake was to say D2C is a new distribution channel, and there are 400 million homes. I think it's like 1.1 billion TV homes worldwide, and we can capture we can capture 400 million in 5 years. You can sort of remember the pitches. It's not just the Warner Brothers Discovery guys. that conversation was going on for a while. There were digital guys who were predicting 1 billion homes, some streaming service reaching 1 billion homes. The belief was that people wanted television on television. And because they wanted television and movies via television, and even like in movies via theater, watching movies on the televisions too, that with more screens and with internet penetration, that they're going to want the same thing on their, in their living rooms. And the most interesting thing was watching Netflix and all this, because Netflix never started. I mean, Netflix's whole point was the cable model sucks. Like you don't get what you want. So let us start with what you want, and we're just going to hyperserve that. And I think that Netflix built a personalization content targeting platform within which the units are TV shows and movies. And I think the legacy media guys built a new distribution channel for their content.
Yeah.
That was sort of, what's the term? It's like not anachronistic, but it was, whatever.
Disconnected.
It just didn't care about who the end user was. It just thought that there was this inelastic demand for television content and for sports content. And that was the driving assumption. And if you are anybody who's been in D2C for the past 25 years, that's the wrong, 26 at this point. Actually even longer, almost 30. Like, that's the wrong assumption. The right assumption is that people want what they want, and you have to, and I the point that I've made, and I rebranded my newsletter from Parkour, which is named my sort of company, to the Medium, which was a nod to Marshall McLuhan. And the Medium is the message, but McLuhan's basic point, which I think when you read it now is written so obtusely and so ridiculously that it kind of gets lost on most people. But his basic point was, don't focus on the content, focus on sort of the architecture of the medium, and that's going to dictate which content succeeds. And what you find is
he was talking about user interface without talking about user interface.
Exactly. And the fact that and the way that that Netflix looked at the internet, it's like, oh, this is not a distribution channel. This is a distribution channel that enables personalization. And, the question is, how do you arrange the puzzle pieces on the back end to make sure that a person in Peoria, Illinois, and a person in, Brussels, Belgium can log into the same app and either watch the same thing, which is the NFL game they just did, or something different, which is, a Belgian drama and, in Stranger Things. And, so it becomes this question of, it's just a very different model. And all the TV guys thought that this was an opportunity for additional scale and that people cared for TV content at scale. But instead, the businesses that have succeeded, and I'll talk about Netflix, come back to Netflix in a second, but like YouTube's a dominant platform on TVs. Why? Because it's figured out that what people really want is content for them, and they don't really care about the professional content. They like creators who do the stuff that they like, and they're able. For me, I can find stuff on anything from business professors to physics to Dave Portnoy pizza reviews, and I'm entertained. Like I don't need. You're not
making a judgment that this is not like legit or professional. When you're
that's right.
When you're enjoying yourself,
I'm fine. It's figuring out what delights me, and that's what it's all about. My favorite, very quick footnote, but it's sort of a really interesting thing. My favorite part of this whole history is Netflix and Jupiter's Legacy, which is back in like 2021. Do you remember when that show? They had like a $200 million budget. They put it out, and like 3 weeks later, they canceled it.
Yes.
And then within a month, they announced that they're pivoting into gaming. I think there's, if I were to write a book tomorrow, the book that I would write is, I think that was at probably the moment when Netflix realized what the future looked like and the legacy media companies didn't. Because Netflix up until that point, you had Reed Hastings talking about becoming the next Disney, he was saying
they wanted IP, right? They wanted
IP. They're going to do amazing things. They were catching up to Disney in animation. You couldn't believe how good they were. And then, And then after that failure, they stopped that story ended. And also their animation division blew up too.
Yeah.
But I think that was the moment, and they think far ahead. So I don't think this was a sudden turn. I think this was sort of, they had the decision tree laid out.
Yeah.
But I think it was the moment where they said, where they basically said the unit costs of content for what we do for delighting consumers on the internet, over the internet distribution just don't need to be Hollywood. And we don't think users care as much as we're learning that users don't care about the IP.
We don't need to be HBO. We don't need Disney. We need to make a lot of stuff that makes a lot of people happy.
But they were also saying that Disney and HBO and all their competition don't need to be that either. And you're only seeing these guys figure this out now, right? I mean, the Agatha All Along from Disney, I think was like $40 million, which was a fraction of anything that they'd done before in streaming. And so I think that I think that's a very difficult challenge for legacy media companies whose enormous scale was to have all this, was to be able to cost effectively produce content, market it, and monetize it. And now you're seeing that that Netflix realized 5 years ago that consumers didn't want this. YouTube has learned and rapidly pushing that people don't want. Exactly. But you still see these guys. And again, you see somebody like Iger, you see somebody like Zaslav, and you even see John Malone when he's defending Warner Brothers Discovery, talking about the value of IP. Whereas really what the internet is a medium that if you understand, again, the medium is the message, you understand that the medium has different tools for delighting consumers than linear TV had, then you'll understand that that's actually wrong. The relationship with IP is not about the movie, not about the show. And again, the relationship with the sports team is not about the broadcast. It's so much more, it's more dynamic. It's not, there's no one size fits all. And the best businesses like New York Times and Crunchyroll are basically at the point where they say, we're just going to make our consumers happy. And New York Times now is saying 32% of their subscribers don't subscribe to news.
Yeah, they're a game company in a lot of ways.
That's stunning. That's crazy. That's crazy. I mean, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have thought they'd be saying that. And I think that, I think all those guys are starting to realize that may be the pitch that they're going to have going forward.
Where is this going? With sports rights, you might assume, when Netflix is getting aggressive now, Amazon's already there. You're going to see everything, all the sports rights go to the big streamers who could pay more. But, with the recent NBA deal, they are hedging their bets. They're still on broadcast. It's still important. There's still some stuff on cable. Does eventually all these rights go to streaming, or is there still going to be a role for the masses and getting this out for free for everybody?
Yeah, I think it's probably there's never going to be one winner. I mean, I don't think streaming is such a specific use case. And again, it also might, coming back to the generational point, it may just be generational, right? I mean, the NFL opt-out is going to be the most fascinating thing to happen, and it's we're much closer to it than we were a couple of years ago, right? We're now.
What do you mean the NFL opt-out?
In 2029, they can opt out of their broadcast. Yeah. So we're much closer to that than we were before.
Yeah.
And I think they know, I mean, look, they're seeing the data that there's a generational shift happening.
Yep.
But the data from the Super Bowl is 120 million people tuned in, and only, and 100, I think it was like 130 something, 120, and then 13.6 were streaming
on Tubi. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's like, there's a takeaway there, but it's not the kind of takeaway that you're asking about, right? Like, is the future going to be all streaming? And I think all the data suggests that people still listen to terrestrial radio. People still listen to satellite radio.
Yeah.
Like, humans don't really change. But so I think that it's just going to be kind of a mishmash of different broadcast models. And I haven't looked at the data close enough to give you a sense of where I think how it's going to play out in terms of numbers. But I think that, I think it's going to be a mishmash. I think that the really interesting question, and I don't know who has the answer for this, is if anybody figures out what it means to super serve the sports fan, and what they'll pay for. But I think again, you're sort of dealing with consumers, and consumers are all are irrational, and then you're dealing with consumers who are sports fans who are highly irrational.
Yes, by nature. Right? That's what it's all about. I want to make sure I don't forget we want to shift gears. You've been writing a lot about generative AI, its impact on this world and just the overall business. Give people some highlights of what you've been working on and where they should be thinking if they're not.
Oh, I appreciate that. So I spent last year. I spent last year. Back in February, I wrote a column for The Information where I interviewed Samir Chowdhury of the YouTube creator duo Colin and Samir. Because they had this really interesting interview with Neil Mohan of YouTube, CEO of YouTube, and I sort of followed up with them. And they all had these fears about generative AI, and I followed up with them. And I kind of to see whether those fears were still true, and they weren't. And I ended up interviewing about 7 other creators, and I've interviewed an 8th actually just in the past week. And the thing that I was trying to understand is, how do you see the world through these visionary builders' eyes? Like, where do they see this all headed? Because they have what's so interesting is they have all these signals about where things are headed. They're very clear-eyed about them. They understand the tech. They are constantly experimenting. And if you ask them, a lot of where this stuff is headed, and one of my favorite interviews was with Edward Sachi, who founded a platform called Showrunner, and Showrunner is very much about is the extreme of if it's in you, it's in here. Which is allowing yourself to create your own TV episodes of animated shows like The Simpsons. And so in other words, it's just text to video prompt. And everybody thinks we're sort of there now, but they think it's going to continue to go down to that extreme at some place in the future. And that's how they see it. And so for me, I'm really just trying to find the signals in the noise, because I think those guys are playing in the future. They're talking about it and thinking about it in very clear ways. And I see my role, some of it's kind of journalistic, some of it's also analytical, which is saying, okay, here's a signal. How do we think about it? What does it tell us about what we're seeing now? I talked about Showrunner. I recently contextualized Showrunner against like Warner Brothers Discovery's business model, and Netflix's bet on games, right? That they're sort of there's things that are analogous, and it's like what can we tease out? But then also, like, how do we start understanding where this stuff is all headed? And things are moving so quickly, and they're moving in a way where there's a real disconnect between these guys who see themselves as tech companies and Hollywood, which sort of sees itself as trying to hold on to a lot of the business models that worked. And my favorite story in that is I spoke to Tom Patton, who's if you remember, there's an fully AI animated movie, generated AI movie that came out it was posted on YouTube like last December or November, and it was called Where the Robots Grow. It was about an hour and a half long. And he told me that he'd approached Hollywood studios and said, I'd like to distribute this. Are you up for it? And they said, yes. Can you wait till, Q2 2025? And he was, which is basically like, 8 months for him. And he said,
no way.
Like I'm a tech company. I have to get this out now.
Yeah. Right.
And so you have that's going to keep on playing out. I don't know when that reconciles. Usually doesn't reconcile anytime soon. But you have these guys who see the future, are taking big swings, producing the content. And I think the signals are really, really interesting. And they give me chock-a-block, like so many interesting business logic and signals. And so I'm trying to spend more time in sussing those out and applying that and surfacing them. The thing that I struggle with is that the essay format really forces me to only focus on very specific ones. And writing a summary of like the different ones doesn't feel as valuable. I could do it, but I just don't feel like it's as valuable. So the thing that I'm working on in 2025 is diving deeper into those signals, pulling out the context, providing a richer view of the different market signals and where things are headed, and helping people filter the signals from the noise, because it is really hard to understand what's going on.
Without giving too much away of what you're writing about, are the creators you've talked to, are they threatened? Are they like, don't want to be replaced by AI like anybody else, or are they like, we got to embrace these tools and change what we're doing?
Yeah, it's the latter. I mean, my favorite line was from Samir Chowdhury, where he said, and again, a great quote that I couldn't use in the column I wrote because it wasn't really relevant. But he basically said, like, if you're not, like, he thinks that AI is going to, I may have used it actually, but anyway, he thinks that what AI is going to do is just add superpowers to people who know how to tell stories, and that's going to play out in great ways on YouTube. But for the people who don't know how to tell stories, like, it's just going to work against them, and they're going to fall by the wayside. And so, and when I talk to these creators, what I'm finding is that these tools don't work unless you really have a skill set. And I think that, like, I mean, I'm sort of curious how it is for you, but for me, I use Claude as an editor. And I don't really, as somebody who edits and somebody who writes, it'll write something. I'll say, well, that doesn't make sense. It'll say, you're right, it doesn't make sense. Let me shift it. Or if you ask it to play the role of Strunk and White, it'll just reduce everything you've written, 1,500 words to 500, and it's a bit heartbreaking. But it may lose the meaning, but it's also doing something really valuable. So the point is that you can't use these tools without the right skill set. So actually, what you're finding is that the skill sets of being a good creator are only going to become more important. And that there is an inherent unreliability in these tools, which you can only have skill sets to harness and manage.
Andrew, I don't need an editor, so that's not really an issue for me, but I can understand why it might help you. Listen, awesome conversation. There's so many different ways we can go here, but thanks so much for your time here. Let's do this again.
Yeah, no, I look forward to it. Thank you. Real pleasure.